How's that? And if you can see him okay, Ms. Reggio, I'm going to start the slideshow.
Yes, sir. Go ahead and open it up and away you go.
Okay, and I want to make sure that you can see the slides and that you can still see me.
Perfect.
All right, great. Hi, I'm Scott Snare. I'm the Dean of the Doctorate in Strategic Security Studies at Henley-Putnam University. I generally give this presentation either online or in the classroom, both to strategic security doctoral students who are learning quantitative analysis, including SPSS, and occasionally I give it to doctoral students who are just learning the basics in writing their dissertation, whether it's a doctor of strategic security or a doctor of science and civil security. A lot of times people come to me about these argumentative fallacies and they say, Scott, isn't it really becoming kind of outdated or antiquated talking about these basic human argumentative errors? In other words, with spy drones and spy satellites, billions of dollars in electronic equipment that allows us to get data and intelligence rather error-free and subjective-free. Isn't it, aren't we at a point where argumentative errors are kind of being squeezed out? In other words, can a human error really counter billions of dollars in electronic equipment? And usually the example that I give people to suggest that they're incorrect is this one here. Historical item from 1985. Pentagon scientists attempted to bounce a laser beam off the Space Shuttle Discovery while it was in orbit. It was an experiment, one of the early experiments in starting up the Strategic Defense Initiative, also known as Star Wars in the media. It was a missile defense system made up of space lasers and mirrors that would help channel those lasers towards intercontinental ballistic missiles. Now the experiment failed miserably because of an interesting reason. The mathematicians and scientists on the ground sent the instructions to the shuttle on how to turn itself while it was in orbit, and they sent the data in nautical miles rather than feet. Honest mistake, costing billions and billions of dollars. When the laser hit the shuttle, the mirror was 180 degrees on the other side of the spaceship. So fortunately, it wasn't a weapons grade intensity laser, or it would have burned a hole in the shuttle, destroying the shuttle and killing the crew on board. So let's make sure that we show some respect for the potential of human analysis and try to avoid human argumentative errors when we collect all of this electronically collected data. Harris and Spiker in 2012, two really amazing scientists in the field of intelligence analysis, and still in the field, by the way. In 2012, they wrote a great paper on using critical analysis in crunching intelligence data. And I like this chart here. I'm using it with their permission. This chart appears in a declassified version of their paper, and I invite you to look at it online. It's called Critical Thinking Skills in Intelligence Analysis. And Harris and Spiker, they make a good point that intelligence, or the intelligence process, is essentially a circular process. It includes taking data, collecting it, looking it over, categorizing it, making inductive reasoning with it, and then forming hypotheses that channels the next iteration of data collection, and the circle continues. Now, where the circular process creates action is at the point of inductive reasoning. Intelligence gathering and intelligence analysis is not deductive reasoning, it's inductive. First, let's talk about what it's not, which is deductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning is when you take a large, agreed upon truth and you magnifying glass it down to a fact that everyone can agree on. For example, if we said that all Army veterans are attractive, and so that's the large generalization that everyone's agreeing on from the start. Then we come down a little bit with a magnifying glass. Scott Snare is an Army veteran. And then we whittle it down a little bit more. Therefore, Scott Snare is handsome. Now, we don't do that with inductive reasoning. We actually start at the top of the pyramid. We make observations. We collect individual pieces of data. And then eventually we induce or we project it down onto a larger agreed upon generalization. So let's go ahead and use that same example. Scott Snare, very attractive. Another Army veteran, Elvis, very attractive. Yet another Army veteran, Korean War veteran, you might not know this. Clint Eastwood. Clint Eastwood, handsome guy. So you look at these individual pieces of data and then you project them onto their larger population. So we have 3 handsome Army veterans, and we are going to induce that probably, generally speaking, Army veterans are a good-looking group of people. Now, from that induction, we go to inferences, which are essentially conclusions. And then from the conclusions, we turn it over to the policymakers who act on those conclusions and recommendations, sometimes not in the way that we might hope. Now, why do I put this chart up here? For a very important reason. The argumentative fallacy can happen in any one of these 8 squares. It can happen at the point of collection, in prioritizing it, how we categorize it, the inductions we make, the conclusions we make, and how we present those conclusions to the policymakers, or for that matter, our bosses who've asked us to collect and analyze that data. So let's go ahead and look at 10 really, really harmful argumentative fallacies with some examples throughout history in the intelligence gathering process. Okay, first, the slippery slope fallacy. Slippery slope fallacy is when we suggest that through a series of occurrences, one action is going to lead to a tragic ending. An example would be if we allow even one immigrant into this country from Vietnamistan, they'll eventually gain control and buildings will crumble to their terrorism. So let's go ahead and look at a historical item from 1954. The direct quote is, you have a row of dominoes set up, you knock over the first one, and what will happen to the last one is a certainty that it will go over very quickly. The fall of Vietnam will lead to the disintegration of Southeast Asia. Who said it? President Eisenhower, briefing the press on why he was going to start channeling money and resources to the French at the time, who were trying to recolonize Vietnam and keep it from becoming communist. And that was the domino theory was the dominant philosophy channeling all kinds of strategy and intelligence gathering and policy making really for about 15 years until we realized that we weren't getting anywhere in trying to keep the inevitable from happening. And so we would just try to scale back, negotiate, and minimize our footprint in that region. The next argumentative fallacy, and probably one of the more commonly used, is overgeneralization. And again, we said that induction was, that key intersection of the process for intelligence analysis. So some generalization has to happen, but certainly there are times throughout history where overgeneralization on a grand scale took place. And overgeneralization is making a broad claim based on very, very limited evidence. For example, we caught a tourist from Vietnamistan spying in the District of Columbia. Therefore, all Vietnamistani tourists must be spies. A historical item that I found was from 1790. This is paraphrased. I was successful in getting the British to surrender in Saratoga, New York. Therefore, I must always attack the British aggressively and head on. This was an historical item. The person who I am paraphrasing is General Horatio Gates, kind of a bit of a scoundrel. At one point, he tried to assume control of the revolution from George Washington. But at least initially, he was a pretty effective general. During the early part of the Revolutionary War, he had recently been part of a major victory over the British, surrounding one of the British armies and forcing them to surrender at Saratoga in late 1777. 2 years later, Gates decided to regain control of a British-held Camden, South Carolina. Now, the intelligence analysts at the time, the tacticians and scouts that reported to General Gates, suggested that he hold off a bit. Over half of Gates's soldiers at the time, following a long march and poor supplies, were suffering from dysentery and exhaustion. However, an overconfident Gates charged forward anyway, in some cases placing poorly trained militia up against combat-tested British troops. And the results, quite frankly, for the Continental Army were disastrous. About 1,000 Continental soldiers were either killed or severely wounded, and another 1,000 after that were taken prisoner by the British. Gates, again, who at one point had designs on overriding Washington and taking over the revolution, lost his command and really barely avoided being court-martialed. The thinking was his political connections kept him from being thrown in prison because it was such a disaster. Why? Because he overgeneralized and he did not pay attention to his intelligence analysts. Okay, post hoc fallacy. Again, I would say another very, very common error and one that's used, wow, an awful lot. I would say maybe even an awful lot in our daily lives. And that is when we assume that since A happened before B, A must be causing B. So if A is followed by B, then A must have caused B. People with good luck charms. Now, the reason they have these good luck charms is they once held their good luck charm, something good happened to them, and they said, well, I grabbed my good luck charm, something good happened. I'm just going to hang on to this good luck charm forever. An example, we opened up our borders to the Potnastami people. Crime has gone up in our cities. Therefore, the Henley-Putnamistani immigrants have caused the increased crime. A historical item from 1991, which, by the way, is still being argued to this day. The Soviet Union has fallen following strong U.S. actions such as our dramatically increased defense spending and our Strategic Defense Initiative. Therefore, our strong anti-Soviet policies have caused the fall of the USSR. Now, I would say most historians look back at the Reagan administration and say, yes, it was a good idea that we toughened up on the Soviets to keep history from repeating itself, or to keep an already Cold War from becoming chillier. But at the same time, to completely disregard what was going on internally in the Soviet Union at the time, and to say that it was simply, Reagan putting the Strategic Defense Initiative in space, that somehow that caused the Soviet Union to crumble under fear of American might. I think that's following the Posthoc Fallacy. Just because one happened before the other doesn't mean that the one caused the other. Okay, begging the question. This is, I think, a favorite of American politicians, and that is answering a question with a statement that simply restates the question. Here's an example. The Putnamistani people are very deceitful because they simply cannot be trusted. Now, I think I could probably put that in a speech and get before a group of people at a home fry and one of those community sit-downs that politicians have. I think I could stand up and say a sentence like that and never miss a beat. And I think politicians do it all the time. However, when you look at the folly of it and you call people out on the folly of it, it certainly breaks down the argument, doesn't it? Because the very definition of deceitful is that someone cannot be trusted. So to make one the reason for the other is bizarre circular reasoning, used all the time very effectively. Here's one from 1941. There was a lot of intelligence, strong intelligence, suggesting that the Japanese were about to attack the Philippines and some U.S. outposts. And however, in the analysis portion of the intelligence gathering, American analysts essentially said, well, we're just going to kind of overlook this, mounting evidence because we think the Japanese really don't have the appetite for it. So essentially what they were saying is, according to our amazing analysis, the Japanese are not going to attack because we don't think they're going to attack. Circular reasoning, very bizarre, and yet that was a lot of the analysis, not the raw data. The raw data says that the day that was going to live in infamy was going to happen, and it was going to happen soon. But the analysis included that rhetorical fallacy, which was, we don't think they're going to attack because we don't think they're going to attack. Okay, false dilemma. If you've ever been to a used car lot, this one has been used on you, I guarantee it. Basically, the car salesperson puts his arm around you and says, all right, Scott, what would you like? What would you like? Would you like the red car or would you like the blue car? And many a car has been sold by limiting the choice of the person walking onto the lot to those two choices. Certainly there are many other choices besides buying the red car or the blue car. The person might like the green car. The person might not be in the market for a car that day. The person might be shopping around and looking at, yes, the red car, but the red car on a bunch of different lots at different prices. So, but again, people can be very, very persuasive by limiting an argument that has many, many choices down to only two choices. So the false dilemma is when we suggest that there are only two possible outcomes, when in fact there are many more than two, or at least three, but usually many, many more than two. An example would be we either wage total war with the Putnam people, or we become their strongest ally. So it's one extreme or the other. We're either going to get along with them famously, or we're going to go to war with them. A historical item from 1950, which this is pretty closely, I wrote paraphrased, but this is pretty close to what a couple of people actually wrote in their analysis. Either the Soviets will completely support the invasion of North Korea into South Korea, or such an invasion will not happen. So the thinking was that all other communist entities in the world at the time were taking their directives from the Soviet Union, and that the Soviet Union was calling the shots. We were pretty confident that the Soviet Union was not telling North Korea to invade South Korea, so we were confident that it wasn't going to happen. Never mind that North Korea could act on its own, or that the Chinese, who we were avoiding or not paying much attention to, might actually have a hand in the decision and might wind up supporting the effort once North Korea poured down into South Korea. Okay, the ad hominem fallacy. This is an interesting one. It's when a person is making a pretty solid argument that you don't agree with, and rather than take on that person's argument, you insult the person, or you demean the person, or you demean their credentials. Pretty powerful way of quickly bringing a solid counter-argument to its stop. An example, his argument for a diplomatic solution cannot work because he's originally from Putnamistan. Here's a historical item from 2001. The FBI, back at the turn of the century, really did an amazing job, considering that they were short-staffed. They had a lot of different overriding objectives. They were underfunded, and their workforce was young. And yet they managed, along with other intelligence agencies, to determine that this guy named Osama bin Laden was funding an operation here in the United States where radical pilots would fly planes into buildings, destroying those buildings. And the evidence and the intelligence was pretty substantial 1 month out from 9/11. Again, pretty amazing intelligence analysis for an agency that was really hanging in on a thread financially and strategically, I would say. So it was presented to the White House. There was a small problem. The president was not at the White House. Matter of fact, he hadn't been at the White House for about a month. He was enjoying a month-long vacation at his ranch just north of Crawford, Texas. So somebody said, well, you know what, this is pretty substantial stuff. Maybe we can get some funding. Maybe we can get action from the commander-in-chief that will focus some resources on this. Maybe we better send somebody over to the ranch to brief the president on this at the tail end of his month-long vacation. So that's what happened. Somebody went, briefed the president on what they thought was about to happen. And I think contemporary historians, I think, have more or less agreed on the notion that President George W. Bush, his vice president, and his cabinet, they had kind of an interesting look at the world, and they had already determined who their enemies were, the axis of evil, of which Osama bin Laden at the time was not included. So essentially what was being happened was some analysis was being presented to the president that ran contrary to the argument that he had already accepted. And rather than immerse himself in this counter-argument, what he said to that visitor who was showing up with this counter-argument was, all right, you've covered your ass now. And I'm guessing the next sentence after that was, now move along. And again, really a very, very quick way for people to either ignore or to bring down a counter-argument, which is to insinuate, as in this case, that the person delivering that counter-argument is this bureaucratic weasel just looking to cover his backside. You make an argument like that, or you make an accusation like that, it demeans the counter-argument rather quickly. Okay, ad populum fallacy is when you present the argument in a way that appeals to the audience. For example, if I were to get up in front of union workers right now and I were to say, those Putnamish are taking our jobs. Well, that would be a way of appealing to the audience and presenting data in a way that was fashioned for the people who were listening to it. Here's another historical item also from 2001. This one not pertaining to 9/11 or Afghanistan, but instead to Iraq. And the direct quote from analysts is, the aluminum tubes purchased by Iraq can only be for nuclear centrifuges. And that played into the weapons of mass destruction that this country was making to the world for invading Iraq and removing Saddam Hussein. Now, in this case, the audience that we're appealing to is not the American public or the international public. In this case, the ad populum fallacy was from the analyst to the audience, which was the Bush administration. The Bush administration was convinced there was weapons of mass destruction, and essentially they were cherry picking or looking for data that would support that notion. Now, most of the intelligence community was pretty strong in offering a counter-argument suggesting that there really weren't weapons of mass destruction, and indeed those aluminum tubes were probably meant for artillery pieces rather than nuclear centrifuges. However, there was a very small contingency of intelligence analysts looking to advance themselves in their career. They knew who their audience was, which was an administration looking to cherry pick intelligence. And they said, well, we're going to fashion our analysis in a way that appeals to our audience, which is an administration who is looking for that very type of data. Again, very clever, but still, any way you slice it, an argumentative fallacy. All right, next one, diversion, red herring. Whenever my wife asks me to do work around the house that I don't feel like doing, I say, hey, how about those Orioles? I don't really care how the Orioles are doing, but I don't want to do housework, so I changed the topic. And that's what the red herring diversion is. It's changing the topic to avoid addressing the main part of the counterargument. For example, you might say, well, our differences with Putnamistan might be insurmountable, but that other country, Henley-Putnam, has become a threat to the United States as well. So an analyst or a politician who is acting on that analysis, rather than addressing the threat for whatever reason, determines that the best way to avoid addressing that threat is to create another threat and take people's attention away from where the actual threat might be. Again, for whatever reason. Historical item, 1966. Yes, the national intelligence estimates suggest strategic failures in South Vietnam. But how about those tactical indicators of success? I would say General McMaster, our new national security advisor, would probably agree with the notion that you have to listen to your analysis as it's being brought in and induced and commented on, and that you cannot you can't cherry pick the optimistic reports that are coming back from the battlefield. First of all, battlefield reports are always optimistic, especially if you just won a particular battle or a particular skirmish. Number of casualties, enemy casualties are going to be exaggerated. The amount of territory you feel like you now control, the amount of time you think you're going to control that territory for are all exaggerated to a point. And so what you have to do is trust the strategists in order to figure out, first of all, what is real and what is static, what's being exaggerated, and really, in the long term, are you going to hold that territory? President Johnson at the time said he didn't want to listen to the strategists. He talked about those optimistic tactical indicators as if it was milk coming from a cow. And he compared the CIA, which was offering a much bleaker assessment, to the tail of the cow that would knock over the bucket of milk just as he was ready to approve more troops or more resources in Vietnam. Those positive reports from the field, that was the milk. But the pessimistic reports of the CIA, that was the tail knocking down the milk. And he didn't like that tail. He wanted to concentrate on the bucket of milk. Okay, this one's a little tough. Used a lot, but not always. It's not always easy to implement, and it's not always easy to spot somebody who's doing it. And that's basically creating a false or simplified counterargument and then opposing it. I would say the most common one that we see nowadays is a politician suggesting that another politician who doesn't want to go into a particular country or doesn't want to send troops into a particular area is not supporting the troops. Hey, that guy doesn't support the troops. Maybe that person does support the troops. Maybe he supports the troops quite a bit by not wanting soldiers to go into an area where there's just no way of ever successfully turning things around. Maybe that person's a veteran who doesn't want to see those soldiers' lives being risked for a no-win situation. But very clever. Rather than addressing that other politician's counterargument that we shouldn't be going into that country, much easier to restate that person's argument in that he's anti-military, he doesn't support the soldiers, and then opposing it. I can't stand the fact that he doesn't support the troops. Example, our diplomats want to negotiate with the Putnamistanis. I fully oppose our diplomats' hatred for patriotism and the American way of life. So what are you doing? You're restating the diplomats' position of wanting to negotiate by saying that they're un-American. And it's very easy to fight somebody's dislike for their country. It's not as easy to fight somebody who is making a sound argument for negotiation. Historical item, 2003. Now that we're occupying Iraq, we must force anyone who is in the Ba'ath political party out of their jobs and therefore out of their spheres of influence. That is paraphrased, but not by too much, from Paul Bremer, who was the civilian head of Iraq after it had been taken over by U.S. forces. The notion was that anybody who had ever registered for the Ba'ath Party would have to be removed from their jobs. Unfortunately, a lot of people in the country had taken jobs or had registered in the Ba'ath Party, not because they were strong supporters of Saddam Hussein, but because they were looking for work. So you had teachers, academic types, doctors, garbage collectors, you name it, that were forced out of their jobs in 2003 because they were registered members of the Ba'ath Party. Also, Mr. Bremer fired 4,000 members of the Iraqi army for no other reason than the commander-in-chief they served was Saddam Hussein. So you had all these very smart people, academic types, professionals, and soldiers all sent packing. The straw man in this argument was support for Saddam Hussein, or that registering for the Ba'ath Party made you anti-American or a covert supporter of Saddam Hussein. So by claiming, oh, he's a member of the Ba'ath Party, let's shove him out of a job, that is where the straw man fallacy, I would argue, in this case came from. Arguing from ignorance. Maybe you've seen a famous singer or actor or sports figure driving an economy car on television. One of these tiny little tin can cars that don't cost more than maybe $12,000 or $13,000. You see them driving around on the commercial talking about how much they love their economy car. Now, these people are rich and they don't drive those type of cars around. So why do we listen to them when they tell us on television to drive that type of car? It's because we respect them, we admire them, they catch our attention when they tell us to do something. A lot of times when they tell us to do something, we run out and do it. So arguing from ignorance is something that we do. Another type of arguing from ignorance is when we refute what the other person is saying because that person has never been at the place that they're talking about firsthand. For example, if you said, well, I think there's little green men on Mars. And then the counter-argument from a very intelligent scientist might be, well, there are no green men on Mars. And I say, oh, well, so you've never been, have you ever been on Mars? Of course, the scientist is going to say that he's never been on Mars. And you say, well, there you go then. So if you suggest that something cannot be disproven, that is the crux of your argument that something must be true, simply because another person cannot disprove it well due to geography or for whatever reason. An example, if you've never been to Putnamistan, then how do you know the little children there don't carry loaded machine guns. Historical item from 1950. The Chinese will not intervene in Korea. They know that as Asians, they are inferior to American forces and that to attack us would be sheer madness. And that is paraphrased from General MacArthur. General MacArthur frowned upon Asians in general, and I hate to say that, but it's true. It was one of his flaws as an amazing strategist and an amazing analyst of intelligence. One of his downsides was that he made decisions based on the notion that Asian soldiers could not fight. And after the North Koreans had already come down into South Korea, surprising everybody, the notion was that the Chinese were not going to help North Korea because they knew that they were Asian and as a result, they knew that they were inferior to the American fighting man. Really silly. But if you look at history and you look at some of the things MacArthur and his strategists who were feeding him data had to say at the time, I'm not paraphrasing too far off from what was actually said. Arguing from ignorance. Just because somebody else cannot disprove the silly thing you're saying, you believe that silly thing to be true. Happens all the time. So that is the 10 argumentative fallacies, how they can be mistakenly used in the analysis of intelligence, and indeed how they've been used mistakenly throughout American history. So at this point, I don't think we're opening up people's microphones, but I think you can enter a question as a kind of a chat text, and I think Ms. Ruggiero can read those questions. Ms. Ruggiero?
Sure. Yeah, that would be great. If people have questions, go ahead and send them over through the questions of the chat, and I'll pick them up. We do have a couple of things, a couple of questions here, Dr. Sneer. One is, couldn't these fallacies be used differently, such as effective tools for persuasion?
Can fallacies be used for persuasion? Was that the question? Could you say it again?
Yes. Couldn't the fallacies be used differently, such as effective tools for persuasion?
Oh, sure. I get that question all the time when I'm teaching doctoral students. It's funny, you have all these grown men and women who've been in management jobs forever, and their eyes light up like little kids at Christmas time, and they're like, hey, some of these are really great. Could I use these, to manage people, or couldn't I use these things to persuade people? And I'm like, oh, absolutely, people do it all the time. But keep in mind that these are fallacies that are not only mistakes in analysis or argumentation, but they're also mistakes in judgment. In other words, if you put somebody down in order to refute his argument, you're doing so knowingly and I would say immorally. So I would say the better way to use these 10 rhetorical fallacies is to recognize them, to know they exist, and when you see somebody else using one of them, to politely call them out on it, so that data and intelligence is being processed and acted on in a truthful way. Anyone else, Ms. Ruggiero?
Oh, thank you, Dr. Sneer. One more question. At what point in the process are the fallacies most likely to occur?
Oh, wow. That's a good question. Let me see if I can go back here. Well, certainly, since it's the politicians who act on the analysis, I would say from the inference to the action, that is where that sort of collection of fallacies is most likely occur. Also, if people know that their commander-in-chief is cherry-picking and looking for a particular type of analysis in order to justify whatever it is that they're looking to do. Also, the inductive reasoning to inference part can also be, that's where that sort of argumentative fallacy can be insertive between inductive reasoning and inferences. But really, at any one, like I said earlier, at any one of those stages, for example, if you use poor argumentation to develop your hypothesis, that's going to rechannel the way you collect your data during the next iteration of that circular process. So really, at any one of those points could the argumentative fallacy steer things in a different and incorrect direction.
Thank you. One question just came in. It says, I read before that a politician might use intelligence the way a drunken man uses a lamppost. That is for illumination or support. And would you agree with the statement?
Yes. I would say, again, for all kinds of reasons, I mean, let's face it, a politician in the United States right now, and I don't want to talk politics, but I will tell you this. I'm just going to throw it out there for the heck of it. I'm a big believer in term limits. Matter of fact, I'm a big believer in one term, where you get voted into the office and you're there for 6 or 8 years, and you never, never, never have to worry about being reelected because you cannot be. Right now, our congressmen and senators cross the street from the federal building that they work in, and they sit down with headsets, just like the people that used to convince us to switch from AT&T to MCI all those years ago. And they call people with money all day long trying to raise money for their reelection. They spend half of their time in Washington is spent on a headset calling rich people and influential political action committees asking for money. A lot of these political action committees have an agenda, and they want something in return for that money. Many of these political action committees are controlled by people with international interests. So it's not that you're taking money from another government, which would be illegal, but kind of 2 or 3 places removed, that is essentially what's happening. And so if you are beholden to the rich, influential entities that put you into office, you're going to be acting on their behalf. And if you're doing that, you're going to be looking for intelligence and intelligence analysis that supports that. So you already know what you're going to do, because the rich people that put you in office, they know what they want you to do, and you're going to help them out. So what you're going to do is you're going to look at the intelligence that, as the person who asked the question said, just like a lamppost, supports you in the things you already know you're going to do.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question. And one more is, shouldn't there be a procedure to filter out these fallacies at an administrative level before the analysis reaches the inferences stage?
Well, I think we're getting better at that. Any way you slice it, I've been to a couple of intelligence conferences recently, and I think any way you slice it, you really get a sense that the intelligence agencies are talking to one another more than they've ever done before, and they're consolidating information and they're coordinating their resources together. And it really is a wonderful thing to see, considering there's 17 agencies. And I think at that coordination point, I think that's the point where you are most likely to sand filter out those fallacies. I think it's when two agencies are coordinating that that the integrity and the proper way of approaching data analysis is going to flesh itself out. Now, that's not to say that when that final report goes to a decision maker that it's still going to be ignored or intentionally misinterpreted. But at least on the intelligence analysis side, I think there already are some places now where that sort of filtering is already happening.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Dr. Snare, and thank you to everyone who's on the line. I want to remind everyone that the slides and the presentation will be available for you to download from our website, www.henley-putnam.edu. It'll be on the home page on Friday. And if you have any additional questions, please feel free to send those over to us as well. Again, I appreciate everyone attending. Thank you very much. Have a great day.
Bye-bye.